You know, when you think about how human civilization got its start, your mind probably jumps to people, kings, farmers, priests, right? But what if I told you the real story? The one that had to happen before any of that starts way, way deeper. We're talking about geology. And right away, that brings up this huge, fascinating puzzle. I mean, you'd think the first big societies would spring up in some lush paradise, right? Gentle weather, lots of rain, easy living. But nope, that is not what happened. The first great civilizations were born in the middle of some of the driest, most hostile deserts on the planet. So, what was going on? What was their secret? Well, the secret wasn't the land itself, it was the river. Or to be exact, rivers. We're talking about two incredibly specific places, these thin, green ribbons of life carved right through the desert. The Nile River Valley in Egypt, and the land squeezed between the Tigris and Euphrates, which we call Mesopotamia. Just look at this. This gives you a perfect idea of how incredibly flat and wide open Mesopotamia is. It's basically one giant floodplain. Geologists have a cool name for it. They call it a four-deep. Think of it like a massive ditch created as tectonic plates mashed together. And this unique setup, this is absolutely key. It might look like a boring blank canvas, but trust me, it's a canvas that nature was about to paint on with some serious force. See, in these bone-dry deserts, the rivers were so much more than just a source of drinking water. They were delivering something priceless, a genuine geological gift. And this gift is what made farming, and with it, all of civilization possible in a place where it had absolutely no business existing. So what was this gift? It's called alluvial soil. And you've got to understand, this isn't the regular sandy desert dirt. Oh no, this is the good stuff. Think of it like a special delivery, top-quality soil, imported directly by the river. As the water rushes along, it scoops up all this great material, silt, clay, sand, packed with nutrients. And then, when it floods, it just drops it all right there on the riverbanks. And let me tell you, this stuff is basically agricultural gold. It is unbelievably fertile, which means you get huge crop yields. It holds on to water like a sponge, which is, kind of important in a desert. And the best part? The floods keep coming, which means the soil is constantly getting a fresh dose of nutrients. It's like a self-renewing, self-fertilizing farm, all thanks to geology. Yeah, and this image shows you exactly how it happens. The process is called stratification. Every single time the river floods, it lays down a new layer. You can see it right here. Layers of fine sand, a little gravel, some silt. This beautiful layering creates the perfect home for plant roots to just dig in and thrive. It is literally nature building the perfect farm, one flood at a time. Okay, so both Egypt and Mesopotamia got this amazing gift of super fertile soil. So story over, right? They're all set? Well, not so fast. Because it turns out the most important part of the story isn't just what the rivers delivered, it's how they delivered it. And that one little detail, well, it changes absolutely everything. And the difference couldn't be more dramatic. I mean, it's night and day. On one hand, you've got Egypt. The Nile's flood was a predictable, gentle gift. It showed up like clockwork every single year, bringing life. Then you look over at Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates, they delivered a violent gift. Their floods were sudden, they were chaotic, and they could literally wipe you off the map. It wasn't a gift you waited for, it was a threat you had to survive. So in Egypt, what you get is this beautiful, harmonious relationship with nature. The Nile wasn't just some river, it was a reliable partner. I mean, people could literally set their calendars by its annual flood. That kind of predictability creates a profound sense of stability, of order in the universe, and that idea seeped into every part of their culture. And get this. The reason for that stability is it's mind-blowing. Recent research shows the Nile has been flowing on its current path for about 30 million years. That's 6 times older than we used to think. And the reason why is deep, deep inside the Earth. There's this sort of conveyor belt in the planet's mantle, this moving rock that has locked the landscape and the river in place. So the Nile's legendary reliability, it's not just a weather pattern. It is literally written into the deep geology of our planet. Okay, now let's flip the coin completely and look at Mesopotamia. Here, the rivers weren't a partner. They were an enemy, an adversary. Sure, they brought life-giving soil, but they also brought this constant, terrifying threat of annihilation. Survival wasn't about getting in sync with the river's rhythm. It was about fighting it, taming it, and trying to control its violent outbursts. And this wasn't just random bad luck. Remember that huge flat floodplain we looked at earlier? That very geography makes the whole region a perfect basin for absolutely massive, catastrophic floods. When big storms roll in, the water has nowhere to drain, and the result is total devastation. That is the geological reality that shaped how everyone in Mesopotamia saw the world. So, let's just boil it down. The key takeaway here is that geology gave both of these places the exact same raw material for building a civilization, that incredible, miraculous alluvial soil. But the delivery system, the actual personality of the rivers, completely, fundamentally different. So that leaves us with the big question, right? How could one simple geological difference, a predictable gift versus a violent one, end up creating two totally different blueprints for civilization? How could it shape everything from the way they farmed, to the way they governed, all the way to the gods they worshipped? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into next. All right, let's get right into it. This is a story of how two ancient rivers, side by side, ended up creating two completely different worlds. I mean, one civilization was built on patience, on order, and the other, well, it was forged in constant crisis and incredible ingenuity. So we start with this puzzle, right? The world's first great civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, both spring up on the banks of rivers. They're basically neighbors in the Fertile Crescent, both blessed with this amazing gift of water. But everything about them, their governments, their gods, their entire outlook on life, was completely different. So what gives? How does that happen? You know, to really get this, we have to think of the rivers themselves as having personalities. The Nile over in Egypt, it was this kind, predictable provider, a gift. But the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, they were just violent, chaotic tyrants. The answer to that question lies in what we're calling their agricultural engines. This is the core system they each built just to survive. And here's the key. This wasn't a choice they made. Their engine was totally dictated by the personality of their river. Okay, so let's head over to Egypt first. We're going to see how the gentle, predictable Nile created a society that basically ran like a perfect clock. Their entire world wasn't built on fighting the river, it was built on waiting for it. For the Egyptians, the river was their clock. It was their calendar. I mean, their whole year was literally broken into 3 seasons, each named for what the Nile was up to. You had Akhit, the flood, Peret, the season for growing, and Shemu, the harvest. For them, life wasn't some big struggle. It was just this predictable, sacred cycle, year after year. And their method for farming was, honestly, unbelievably simple. They didn't dig these huge, complex canals to try and control the river. No, instead, they just built these low walls to welcome it in. The flood would come, fill up these basins, and just soak the soil with water and fresh, fertile silt. It was a totally passive, patient system. So, this is the really crucial point here. Egypt's agricultural engine, it wasn't built on backbreaking labor or some kind of frantic engineering. It was built on waiting, on patience, and on this absolute, unshakable faith in the calendar. The gods were good, the river was going to provide, and the cycle would just continue. Simple as that. All right, now let's pivot. Let's go over to Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, the story is the complete opposite. It's a constant, high-stakes battle for survival, where waiting for the river, well, that meant you starved. You see, unlike the Nile's helpful summer flood that got the fields ready for planting, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded violently and totally unpredictably in the spring. So just as farmers were planting their new crops, a flash flood could just surge through and destroy the entire year's food supply in a single afternoon. This created a permanent water crisis. They just could not afford to sit back and wait for a gift, because their rivers weren't givers. They were a constant, deadly threat. To be a farmer there was to live on what they called a crisis footing, where starvation was always just one bad flood away. This constant crisis, it forced them to become the world's first great engineers. They couldn't trust the river, so they had to control it. They built these massive levees to hold back the floods. They dug incredibly complex networks of canals to bring water to the dry lands far from the river. They basically created the first ever year-round artificial irrigation system. And this brings us to the core idea of this whole explainer, what we're calling the Great Divergence. These two totally different approaches to farming, they weren't just about growing food. They created two fundamentally different blueprints for how you build an entire society. This slide right here, this is the heart of it. On one side, you've got Egypt, a passive, calendar-based society that saw its river as a provider. Their whole philosophy was waiting. On the other side, Mesopotamia, an active, engineering-based society that saw its rivers as an adversary. Their philosophy was taming. This single difference, it set them on two completely different paths. So, why does all this matter? Well, because the way you feed your people completely determines the kind of society you're going to build. The agricultural engine literally creates the engine of the state. Just think about the consequences in Mesopotamia for a second. You can't build a massive canal system with just a few farmers. It takes thousands of people, all organized, all working together towards one goal. And who organizes them? Who decides where the canals go? Who gets the water? Who maintains the levees? You need a government. You need a bureaucracy. There's actually a name for this concept. A historian named Carl Wittfogel called it a hydraulic society. It's basically a civilization where all political power comes from controlling the water. By managing that irrigation system, the thing that everyone needed for food, a centralized authority, whether it's a king or a priesthood or a bureaucracy, they could control the entire population. So what you end up with are these two totally different blueprints. Egypt's path was set by the calendar. Their blueprint for civilization was all about cosmic order, stability, and repetition, with a divine pharaoh at the top making sure those cycles continued. But Mesopotamia? Their path was a constant battle of human will against total chaos. Their blueprint was all about endless innovation, problem-solving, and centralized control just to impose some kind of order on a very hostile world. But that need to control the water, that incredible engineering, it had a huge social consequence. It required a level of organized labor and central planning that humanity had never even attempted before. It forced them to build, and in one famous case, to build something truly monumental that failed spectacularly. And that story is exactly where we're going next. You know, we often think of canals and dams as just engineering. But what if I told you the struggle to control water didn't just build canals? It literally built civilization itself. So, to really get into this, we're going to start with a failure. A truly colossal one, actually. Let's head back to ancient Egypt to a project called Sad el-Khafra, or the Dam of the Pagans. We're talking around 2600 BC. This thing was a monumental undertaking. It stretched 113 meters long, a massive wall of rock and gravel designed to tame a seasonal riverbed. And get this, it stood an impressive 14 meters high. I mean, that's a testament to just how ambitious these Old Kingdom engineers were. They were really pushing the boundaries of what anyone thought was possible. But, and this is a big but, in all their incredible planning, they made one fatal mistake. They completely forgot to build a spillway. There was no way to relieve the pressure if a huge flood came roaring down that riverbed. And the consequences of that one little oversight? Absolutely catastrophic. Before the dam was even finished, a single massive flood hit it. The pressure just built and built, the water poured over the top, and boom, the entire structure was obliterated. 100,000 tons of material just washed away like it was nothing. The failure was so total, so demoralizing, that it basically set Egyptian engineering back for centuries. They wouldn't even try to build another major dam for over 700 years. Think about that. So you gotta ask, right? If the risks were that high, why would anyone even try something like this? Well, to get the answer, we have to leave Egypt for a minute and head over to Mesopotamia, where a very, very different story was unfolding. See, unlike the Egyptians, who were pretty blessed with the gentle, predictable flooding of the Nile, the people of Mesopotamia were on a constant crisis footing. I mean, they were battling two violent, chaotic rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which could flood at any moment and just wipe everything out. So for them, taming the water wasn't about ambition. It was about pure survival. And that constant crisis, it forced them to invent something entirely new, the state. Think about it. Building and managing this huge, complex network of irrigation canals was a logistical nightmare. You couldn't just dig a ditch and call it a day. It needed constant upkeep, year-round. It was way too big for a single village to handle. And, of course, it immediately created fights over who gets how much water. And to solve these incredibly complex problems, this new class of people started to emerge. People whose only job was to manage the system. to plan, to organize, to settle all those disputes. Yep, you heard that right. They invented bureaucracy. And just like that, this need for management created the world's first real social hierarchy. You had the laborers at the bottom, then the overseers, then the administrators, all the way up to the king at the top. This entire structure existed for basically one reason: to keep the water flowing. Now, there's actually a name for this whole process. Anthropologists call it the hydraulic hypothesis. It's this powerful idea that the physical act of managing water didn't just support the state, it directly created it. It's a perfect example of how our most fundamental social structures are often just a direct response to our environment. Control the water, you build a civilization. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's circle back to Egypt for a second. Let's look at that spectacular failure, the Sad el-Kafr Dam, through this new lens. The crucial difference, really, it all comes down to one word: motivation. For Mesopotamia, managing water was born out of absolute desperate necessity. But for Egypt, well, the Sad al-Kafara wasn't even on the main Nile River. It was this ambitious side project, just an attempt to capture some extra runoff to maybe get a little bit of an edge. And that right there is the key. Mesopotamia succeeded and paid the heavy social cost of creating this rigid hierarchy because they had no other choice. Egypt failed because they merely tried to. And in doing so, they learned a really hard lesson about the limits of human engineering against the raw power of geology. Ultimately, when you put these two stories right next to each other, they reveal a pretty profound truth about how our world was formed, and really how all societies develop. It really does confirm that old saying, geography is destiny. The very nature of the rivers themselves, whether they were a gentle partner or a violent enemy, directly shaped the societies that grew up on their banks. It forced two completely different human systems into existence. So really, the story of the first cities is the story of geology. It all started with a gift, that amazing fertile soil. But how that gift was delivered, as a predictable gentle flood or a violent chaotic one, well, that determined everything that came next. It created two completely different engines for civilization, and those engines built two completely different worlds. So we've just seen how rivers can literally create entire civilizations from the ground up. Tomorrow, we're going to flip that on its head and explore the exact opposite, how the greatest natural barriers on Earth, mountains, became the world's first walls. If you're enjoying this deep dive, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the rest of our Geopolitics and Geography Week. And hey, let us know what you think in the community poll. Which one has shaped history more, rivers or mountains? We'll see you tomorrow.